Hi guys, this is Mike. In this tutorial, I'm going to give you a beginner's guide to animating within Cinema 4D. So if you open up your Lesson 01 Begin file, you'll see a very basic scene. We just have a camera, a sky, a landscape, and this rocket ship, which we're going to animate. So to begin, we're going to go over some basics in order to get you started on animating. And the best place to start is to go to your project settings. You can reach that by going to Control D, and you can see that we have some settings here that we can adjust. The first place that you want to go to is the FPS or frame rate. We're going to leave it at default, but I just want you to be aware that you can adjust this. And just if you absolutely know that what frame rate that you're going to be using, I wouldn't adjust this too much. Now we also have our minimum time and maximum time, and our preview min time and our preview max time. Now you're going to notice that that is the same as what we have down here in these settings here within your timeline. So if you want to adjust your minimum time, you can do that by using these little arrows or typing in within this field to give it an absolute value. And you can do that for your maximum time as well. Now just be aware you can't go below in your preview min time what value that you have here in your minimum time. So you can see that won't change, but if you bring it down to say -5, then you can bring your preview time down. And you can see that adjust within your timeline. And of course, you can do that within your maximum time and preview max time as well. Now you can also adjust your frames here in this value here, and on this side as well. Now your preview slider you can adjust by just clicking and dragging and sliding. That way it gives you sort of a zoomed in amount of where you want to start working. Say you want to take a part of your timeline and just concentrate on that, you can just adjust your timeline so you don't have this whole timeline of all these keyframes. You can just kind of take a little snapshot by moving this preview slider. You can also adjust this preview slider by just double clicking within this on either side in order to give you a preview time. Say you want to know exactly where you want to go, say 30 frames by like say 45 frames or something like that. You can do that as well. And say you wanted to go to a specific place on your timeline, you can do that by just going to this value over here all the way on the right, and say you can just type in 45, you want to go right to that frame. So it just gives you some options of which to accurately go to which frame that you want to go to. Now speaking of frames, you can also adjust the timeline to go to seconds, and I do that as well. So if you go to your edit and then come down here to preferences, you can go to units and then come over here where it says animation unit, you can change that to seconds. So when you come over here, now your timeline is based not on frames, but on seconds. So that just kind of gives you, I like to use this back and forth between the seconds and the frames, just to get my head around a certain part of a project. If I know it's going to be a certain amount of time, I'll go back and forth. And that way I know, okay, because sometimes I think in seconds and not in frames. So if I know that this can only be 3 seconds or 10-second video, I'll know how long I'm going along within this process. So it just kind of helps out a little bit. So I'm going to go back to frames since that's the default. Okay, great. So one other thing that I want to show you with preferences, or in your project settings, I mean, if you go to key interpolation, you have a different way of interpolating your animation. you have spline, which is at default. That's a very smooth animation curve. But you can also go to linear and step. Now, linear is very robotic. It's very clear cut, and there's very little transition. And step is a lot for just blocking in your animation. I like using step when you just want to concentrate on position and posing your either your character or whatever you're trying to animate. So it's a good way to just focus in on that. And then when you want to start doing some polish and polishing up your animation, you'll go to spline. But we're just going to keep it to spline, and I just want to keep you let you know that this is available. Okay, so let's start adding in some keyframes, and this will allow us to start animating within Cinema 4D. So in order to add in a keyframe, we can come over to this icon here, and you can see this little key. Now I want to go to my rocket ship in my layer, or in my objects manager. So click on the rocket ship and then go to coordinates. So if you're going to be animating within Cinema 4D and you're going to be putting in keyframes, and say for an example, in this simple example where we're just moving an object, you're going to be animating most likely within the coordinate manager along with your timeline. So what I mean by that is anything that you move within these values can be keyframed and animated. And you can notice that we have these circles next to all of these values. So your X, Y, and Z, your scale in the X, Y, and Z, and your heading, pitch, and banking, your HPB. So I'm going to add in a keyframe all the way at the beginning of our timeline. And so I'm going to add in this keyframe. But before I do that, I want you to keep in mind that we have ways of turning off certain parts that we don't want to keyframe. Say we just want to use our direction, and we just want to translate our object over into onto one screen, one part of the screen to the next. We don't want to clutter up our timeline with keyframes that have scale and rotation when we're not using them. So what we can do is we can add in a keyframe for just having the position on and not rotation and scale. So I'm going to press my keyframe or my key icon so we can have a keyframe. And you'll notice now that we have these circles, they all turn red. And if I move along my timeline, these red circles are just, we don't have a solid red circle, we just have an open circle. So that knows when you're on a keyframe and it's a solid color, you know you're on a keyframe. If you're moving off and it's an open circle, you know you're not on a keyframe. So these are all just visual cues that I'm showing you as you're animating. You can know what they are when you're animating. So I made a keyframe, but you'll notice that we have the X, Y, and Z also solid colors. We also have keys on those as well. But if we just wanted to animate, say, just on the X, we still have these keyframes on. So what we can do is if I undo this and I undo our keyframe, I can just add in a keyframe just on the X. So if I'm going to be moving along on the X position, and let me undo back, all I would want to do is just command click on this circle, and now I have a keyframe. And then let me go back to my object. Oops, I accidentally put that on my camera. Let me undo back there. So I'm on my rocket ship, command click on this circle, and you can see now we have a keyframe just on the X and not in the Y and Z. So I'm going to move this along our screen here. And now you can see, let me move back for just a second. let's move along our timeline. So say we want to move to, say, a little bit farther down the timeline. And you can see that now we have our open circle. And I command click, or excuse me, I move our object on the keyframe along the screen. And you can see now that we have an orange open circle. So what that's telling you is that this object has been moved, but it hasn't been saved yet. So whenever you see that orange circle, you know that, okay, I moved my object along the timeline somewhere within 3D space, but it hasn't been saved. That position hasn't been saved yet. In order to save that, then you'll have to command click on the circle. Now you can see this keyframe, and now you have your animation. So these are all just visual cues that you're going to be seeing, and you'll know what to do when you see them. So as you go along, you can see that we have an open red circle, and now we have a solid circle on each of the keyframes. And now you're going to see that we have this animation path. This animation path also has visual cues of what's going on within your animation. So say for an example, I move my keyframe down a little bit. You can see these dots in between the keyframe. And you can see how they adjust. If I move very close to these keyframes together, you can see that these positions of the dots get spread out. But if I pull it very close together, they get very tight. So that gives you it lets you know how quickly your object is going to be moving within your viewport. So if I go all the way to this beginning of our timeline and I press play, you can see how this animation plays out. Now if I move this forward, or closer together, excuse me, you can see how these dots are now starting to spread out a little bit, and now when I press play, it's much quicker. So these are all just visual cues on how to use your animation path. So now this is a good place to start talking about the controls that we have here, and you'll see that a lot of these will be pretty familiar to you. We have this icon here that will go to the beginning of your timeline, and this will go to the very end of your timeline. Now we also have these icons here, and what these will do, these arrows right in between here, they're going to go to your keyframes. So if you click on them, they'll go to the next available keyframe. And then we have our these icons that will allow us to go to the next next frame, not keyframe, but the next frame. So if you click on it, it'll go to the next frame and move forward. And then you have your play and pause. Now we have our keyframes that we talked about. Now we also have another icon here called autokey. Now what this will allow us to do is to animate in a little bit more of a natural way. So let me show you. We have to have a keyframe, already have a keyframe on. So we have our two here. So we have our next one here. So say I want to add in another keyframe. So I click on auto key, and you know it's active by this red border that goes around our viewport. So now we're in auto key mode, and it's ready to take a position within our viewport. So say for an example, I move my little jet here. I move that forward a little bit. now you're going to see that that automatically adds in a keyframe. Now I just want you to be aware of, once you're finished using the auto keying, to make sure you turn it off. And you can see that visual cue, that red border, is now off. So now anytime you move your object that you're animating, if you just move away, it's not keyed in. So it's just auto keying is very a natural way of adding in keyframes. You don't have to keep going back and adding keys. But I do want you to be aware of that once we have those keys in, you can, once you're using auto keying, is sometimes you'll add in a lot of keyframes for positions and scale and rotation that you may not particularly need. So it's a good way of using it. It's very natural, but if you're going to be very specific and very tight with your animation, and only using, say, position and rotation, if I click on the object, if you're only going to be adding in some of these other positions, because now what we have here is these red circles are now on when all you're doing is just moving that one object along the X. So let me show you. So we're just moving along the X. You can see this value changing, but we still have these keyframes here. So I just want you to be aware that happens when you're using auto key. So I'm going to continue talking about the timeline here in this lesson. So one thing that you can do is when you click and drag within your timeline, and you hold down your mouse button, you can see that we have this gray highlight or gray selection path that we have here on our timeline. And then if I release, you can see that now we have our keyframes highlighted and we have this gray selection that goes along our timeline. What you can do is you can click and drag in the middle of your timeline. And when I mean middle, in between these 2 points, you might be a little bit difficult to see them, but you can drag these keyframes along your timeline. Now these little points here, what you can do is you can click and drag them, and you'll notice that the keyframes move, but they also get closer to each other as you move down to the other side of that selection. And you can use that on the other side as well, this little point. Whoops, excuse me, I clicked off of that. So let me try that again. And you can see that now that you can adjust your keyframes using this selection. And so you can see how that affects your animation. So say you wanted it a little bit tighter and you wanted a more of a faster takeoff, and you can see that thing really moves. So you can kind of do things like that. And let me go back to the keyframe. And you can deselect that by just kind of clicking anywhere on the timeline that's not highlighted. So we have this keyframe. And if I go back to my rocket ship and I move my object a little bit farther away, you can see now it's orange, and I command click, that overwrites that keyframe. So now we have even a faster animation, almost kind of as it's gearing up, it can kind of speeds off. So the next thing I want to talk about, since we're on this highlighting of these keyframes, what you can do is you can drag those and select all the keyframes, and then you can right click. You have an option here, if you go to edit, you can reverse sequence. So there might be a situation where you're animating, but you'll feel that the sequence can be reversed and it will give you a different type of look. So if I play by pressing my space bar, you can see that kind of comes in a different, it comes in reverse. So it's just another option for you. So I'm going to undo, go back to our original, and we can play that. Now you'll also notice that we have another option here. If I right click and I go to options, we also have ripple edit. And if I right click again, and you go to options, you can see that this is now checked. So now we're in ripple edit. So what that does is if you select a keyframe, or if you click on a keyframe and you move it, you can move these keyframes, and any keyframes that are following the keyframe that you're moving will move as well. So it's a pretty good option if you want to move a whole amount of keyframes down your timeline. So for an example, say you realize that you don't want your jet to start taking off right when the movie plays. So when you first play, the jet takes off. But what if you wanted to have a bit of a pause? So what you can do is you can click and drag all these keyframes by just clicking this keyframe, going to ripple edit and clicking on this keyframe, and now you can move all the work that you did. Say, I mean, this is a very simple animation, but what if you had all these keyframes along this timeline? Imagine how hard it would be having to adjust all of that when all you have to do is just go to ripple edit and then move everything down the timeline for, like, say another, 10 frames or so. And now when you press play, there's a bit of a pause before it takes off. So we definitely have some options here. Now let's take a look at our animation path. If I rotate around, and let me zoom out a bit, you can see that we have a way to manipulate the animation path by clicking on these points. Now this one's not going to be able to move, but on the ends, you can see how we can move this animation a little bit. And then we move up a little bit further along the timeline. You can see how you can adjust your animation path by adjusting these points. And so it's just a nice way of being able to make adjustments right within your viewport on how your object will be animating. So open up Lesson 03 Begin file, and what you'll see is a similar scene that we had before. The only difference is that I have my camera set up, and it's kind of like in an upward angle. And what we're going to do is we're going to tie everything that we just learned together into one animation. So what I like to do when I'm using a camera, I like to right click, go to Cinema 4D tags, and go to protection tag. So what that does is once you're looking through a camera and you have a protection tag on, you can't move around your viewport. And what that'll do is that'll lock down your camera view so you don't lose track of it if you forget that you're actually looking through your camera and you move around your scene and you lose your space, your place when you're looking through your camera. So that's all the only reason why I do that. So I'm gonna turn off my camera for a sec, or unlook through my camera. And what I want to do is I want to have my plane, my little rocket ship, just kind of zoom past our camera. And so what I want to do is, what we could do is we can go to our top view and we can kind of take a look at this scene in a top view kind of way where we can kind of plan out our animation a little bit. So I'm going to click on my rocket ship in my object manager, and I want to point it towards our camera. It doesn't have to be exact, but just kind of going in the direction that we want. We're at the beginning of our timeline, and what I want to do is I just want to bring my jet to right across, diagonally across our camera view. So with my rocket ship selected, and we have our directional tool set here, let's add in a keyframe, and let's move along our timeline. And I'm just randomly choosing a frames here, with a frame that to put our key on. And I'm just going to bring our rocket ship right across our view of our camera. And now looking through our coordinate system, you can see that we have our position, how it's changed. So what we can do is we can add in our keyframe here. Let's play that, see how that looks just from this top view. So it's pretty slow, but that's okay. We're gonna make a lot of adjustments. So let's look through our camera view. So let's go to our perspective view and then look through our camera and see how that looks. Okay, not too bad. But let's say we want to have this kind of come up a little bit. So we grab the end of our animation path. Almost like it's coming in for a landing almost. So let's give it a play. See how that looks, okay? And so what maybe I also want to do is give this sort of a bend to our animation. So let's unlook through our camera. Let's start our auto keying. So if I go somewhere in the middle of our keyframes, turn on auto keying, and then like maybe move it over to the side here, you can see this nice bend that we have to our animation path. So let's turn off our auto keying. Look through our camera and see how this turns out. Okay, pretty cool, but maybe let's bring our animation path a little bit over to the side. Now, I don't know if you know about working within thirds, but whenever setting up a composition for any type of work that you do, whether it be graphic design or animation, you always want to break down your scene, your composition into thirds. So if you have a third of your screen here and a third of your screen here, you always want to work within those thirds. And we also have thirds going across horizontal and another third going across horizontal here. So kind of break down your scene into these little third parts. And you want to know where these intersecting lines are in the thirds. And you'll see this with photography, you'll see this with filmmaking and setting up shots, is that you'll be always breaking down your composition into thirds. It's also a term called the golden ratio. I highly recommend looking up and researching the golden ratio because it will help you anytime you're building out your composition. And excuse me, you also want to take a look at the Fibonacci sequence when breaking down, say, numbers within your animation. So always thinking, if you're not sure how long or how far things should be put, and you're thinking about values, and if you're just kind of lost without nothing to hold on to, use those Fibonacci numbers, that Fibonacci sequence, as just kind of a guideline. And when you look at them, you use those numbers when planning out a lot of your animation. So it's just a point that I want to make with composition. I don't want to get too deeply on it. I don't want to get you too bogged down on it. I just want you to realize that when you're breaking down a composition, there is a thought process that helps you design a little bit better. So, and that's kind of how I'm thinking here, is kind of breaking this down into thirds as this animation kind of comes through. So let's give it another play. Okay, the only thing that I want to do next is kind of give this a little bit of a rotation. So I'm going to go back to my rocket ship, and I want to add in a key for the rotation. So if you're not too familiar with heading, pitch, and banking, it's always a good idea to just kind of test to see, okay, that's my heading, that's my pitch, and here's my banking. So it's just when you're kind of thinking about adding in some rotation to what you want to do, think in terms of these, always kind of test it out and see how it looks before you start adding in the keyframes. So I think I'm going to be adding in a little bit of keys to all of these in order to get sort of a really nice looking kind of path as we animate through our scene. So let's add in a keyframe here, here, and here. And I'm not sure exactly where I want to place these just yet. So maybe I want to adjust the heading. Maybe I want to adjust the pitch. And I definitely want to adjust the banking. So now you notice that these are now orange. Open orange circles, so we know they're ready to accept a keyframe and save these down. So I'm just going to command click on each one of these circles. Let's take a look at how that looks. Well, I kind of like how this is kind of coming in. So it's kind of coming through in a kind of a strange angle. So as we come along here, let's kind of give this another keyframe, say about here. And let's turn this around, give this a good angle here. And maybe bring this pitch up as it's kind of pitching up to sort of get a little bit of wind resistance as it's coming down. Let's kind of slow it down a bit. Maybe it's coming a little too fast. And as for the angle here, let's maybe just adjust this a little bit. I like this kind of banking that we have. I think having that kind of banked a little bit, like on an angle, I think would look pretty cool. So I'm definitely not an expert on this, but it's kind of going by your eye and seeing how it looks. All right, looks pretty cool. Let's give this one more play here. I think my only gripe is how it starts. So what I want to do is maybe make some adjustments and maybe turn this almost maybe this way. And this is where a little bit of experimenting will help you out a little bit. Pretty nice, pretty nice. I like how this is turning out. And you can always maybe even have this come up out of screen, out of the shot. And if that's the case, oops, excuse me. Didn't mean to do that. And if that's the case, then maybe add this pitch down a little bit and adjust this heading just slightly. So as it's coming in, on this angle a little bit. Yeah, maybe yeah, I think I'm going to keep it to the way I had before. Seems to be a little bit more natural. Now that I moved it out of the scene, out of the shot, I think that works better. Okay, so the last thing that I would like to do is just kind of make it a little bit faster. So we can do that by just kind of selecting everything and just clicking on our end of our timeline of our selection and just kind of tightening everything up. That's pretty good. Could even be a little bit more faster. And this is your own eye. I think I want to pull this in a little bit tighter too. See how that looks? Yeah, that looks really nice. So, you can definitely play a little bit with this a little bit more, but I think this kind of pulls together everything that we've been talking about in terms of a beginner animation. Definitely play around with this scene file and experiment. And sometimes that's one of the best ways to learn when you're animating, is just take an existing file and just kind of playing around with some of these keyframes, adjust the animations, adjust the settings, in the coordinates, and just kind of play with how this, is gonna, the final result and how you want it to come through. I put a link in the description to download project files. You can also go to astronomic3d.com to download project files from this tutorial and all the tutorials that I've made so far. Thanks for watching.